The quiet village of Frosthaven sat nestled deep in a snowy valley, surrounded by a thick forest that seemed untouched by time. The residents lived in simple wooden houses, their roofs perpetually blanketed in snow. Frosthaven had a reputation for its serene beauty and warm community, but it also carried a darker legacy, one tied to the forest and a tragic Christmas Eve long forgotten by most. For Emily and Mark, a young couple from the bustling city, Frosthaven was the perfect escape from their hectic lives. They had rented a quaint cabin on the outskirts of the village, eager for a peaceful Christmas holiday away from the crowds and noise. Snow had been falling steadily since they arrived, covering the ground in a pristine white carpet. The air was crisp and still, with only the occasional sound of a bird or the distant creak of trees breaking the silence. "This is perfect," Emily said, standing on the porch of their cabin with a steaming mug of cocoa in hand. She gazed out at the snow-covered forest, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Mark wrapped his arms around her from behind, planting a kiss on her temple. "It's like a postcard," he agreed. "No traffic, no deadlines, just us and the snow." They spent the day exploring the village, visiting the small market where locals sold handmade ornaments and fresh-baked pastries. The townsfolk were kind but reserved, offering polite smiles and little else. Emily noticed that the villagers seemed worried when she mentioned their cabin near the forest, but no one elaborated. That night, snow continued to fall, blanketing the village in an even thicker layer of white. Emily and Mark sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames chasing away the chill as they exchanged small gifts. "This feels like the Christmases I had as a kid," Emily said, unwrapping a beautifully carved wooden star Mark had bought for her at the market. "Simple and magical," Mark smiled. "I figured we could hang it on that old tree out front tomorrow." As they talked, a faint sound reached their ears, a soft whisper carried on the wind. Emily froze, tilting her head to listen. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark frowned. "Hear what?" "It sounded like singing," she said, "but distant." Mark listened for a moment, but all he heard was the crackle of the fire. "Probably the wind," he said, trying to reassure her. "It's been picking up since sundown." Emily nodded, but a lingering unease settled in her chest. She decided to dismiss it as her imagination and focus on the cozy moment with Mark. The next morning, Emily woke early and stepped outside to breathe in the crisp air. The snow sparkled in the pale light of dawn, and everything was still. But as she walked toward the edge of the yard, she stopped abruptly. There, in the untouched snow, were footprints. The tracks were small, like those of a child, and they led from the forest to the middle of the yard before disappearing. There was no return trail, no indication of where the person had gone. "Mark," Emily called, her voice shaking slightly. "Come look at this." Mark came outside, pulling his coat tight against the cold. When he saw the footprints, his brow furrowed. "That's strange," he said. "Maybe one of the villagers." Emily shook her head. "Why would a child walk all the way out here in the snow? And where did they go?" "The tracks just stopped." Mark studied the footprints for a moment before shrugging. "It's probably just someone messing around. Let's not let it ruin our day." But as they went about their morning, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the footprints were more than just a prank. She kept glancing toward the forest, her unease growing. Later that afternoon, Emily suggested they take a walk through the woods. Mark hesitated, but she insisted, hoping the fresh air and exercise would calm her nerves. They donned their thickest coats and boots and set off, their breath visible in the frosty air. The forest was silent except for the crunch of their boots in the snow. The trees loomed overhead, their branches heavy with snow. It was beautiful, but also a stark contrast to the cozy warmth of their cabin. As they walked deeper into the woods, the sound came again, a faint, melodic whisper that seemed to echo between the trees. Emily stopped, her heart racing. "Do you hear it now?" she asked. Mark nodded, his face pale. "It's singing." "Who would be out here?" The whisper grew louder, though it was still distant, as if carried on an unseen breeze. The melody was haunting, a wordless tune that seemed both beautiful and mournful. "We should go back," Mark said, gripping Emily's hand. But Emily felt drawn to the sound, as if it were calling to her. Without realizing it, she took a step forward, then another. "Emily." "No," Mark said, pulling her back. "We're leaving." Reluctantly, she allowed him to lead her out of the forest, but the melody lingered in her mind, haunting her even after they returned to the cabin. That evening, unable to shake her curiosity, Emily decided to ask one of the villagers about the strange events. She approached an older woman named Clara, who ran the bakery. "Have you ever heard singing in the woods?" Emily asked hesitantly. Clara's face darkened, and she glanced around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "You shouldn't talk about such things," she said in a low voice, "especially not on Christmas Eve." "Why?" Emily pressed. "What's going on?" Clara sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's an old story, one the villagers don't like to speak of. But since you're staying near the forest, you deserve to know." She leaned closer and began to speak. "Many years ago, on a Christmas Eve much like this one, a little girl named Annabelle got lost in the woods. She had been chasing a stray dog and wandered too far. The villagers searched for her through the night, but the snow was falling so heavily that they couldn't find her." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to her?" Clara's eyes glistened with tears. "They found her the next morning, frozen beneath an old oak tree. They say her spirit lingers in the forest, singing to guide others who are lost. But sometimes, the singing isn't a call for help. It's a warning." "A warning of what?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Clara hesitated before answering. "Of something darker in the woods. Something that watches, waiting for those who stray too far." That night, as snow fell steadily outside, Emily and Mark tried to sleep, but the singing returned. It was louder now, clearer, as if it were just outside their window. Emily sat up, her heart pounding. "Mark, it's back." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Just ignore it." But she couldn't. The melody seemed to seep into her very soul, pulling her toward the forest. She got out of bed and began to dress. "What are you doing?" Mark demanded. "I have to find her," Emily said. "If it's the girl, if she needs help." "Emily, this is insane," Mark said, locking the door. "You heard Clara. This isn't just some lost child. It's dangerous." But Emily was determined. She pushed past him and stepped out into the snow, the singing guiding her steps. Mark cursed under his breath but followed her, grabbing a flashlight on the way out. The forest was darker than before, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. The singing grew louder, leading them deeper into the woods. Emily's breath came in short gasps, her fear mingling with a strange sense of purpose. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky. Beneath it was a figure, a small girl in a tattered dress, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Annabelle," Emily whispered, stepping closer. The girl opened her mouth to sing, but no sound came out. Instead, the forest erupted with a guttural growl, and the shadows around the clearing began to shift. A dark figure emerged from the trees, its form massive and distorted. Mark grabbed Emily's hand, yanking her back. "Run!" They sprinted through the forest, the creature's growls echoing behind them. The singing turned frantic, guiding them back to the cabin. As they slammed the door shut, the sound stopped, and the forest fell silent. The next morning, the footprints in the snow were gone, and the singing did not return. Emily and Mark packed their belongings and left Frosthaven without looking back. But as they drove away, Emily glanced at the forest one last time. There, beneath the ancient oak, stood the figure of a little girl, watching them leave. And though Emily never heard the singing again, she could still feel its haunting melody echoing in her mind, a warning of the darkness that lurks in the snow. It was a cold and silent Christmas Eve in the bustling city. The streets, usually alive with honking cars and hurried pedestrians, were now blanketed in a gentle layer of snow. Brightly lit shop windows showcased festive decorations, and faint carols played in the distance, echoing through the frosty air. But for Emma Wilcox, this was just another lonely night. Emma had moved to the city 2 years ago to chase her dreams of becoming an artist. Life here was vibrant and exciting, but the holidays had a way of emphasizing her isolation. Her family was miles away, and her friendships were mostly surface-level acquaintances. Tonight, she had planned to sip wine, sketch by her Christmas tree, and maybe binge-watch her favorite holiday movies. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Emma had just poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto the couch with her sketchbook when her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. Emma hesitated. Normally, she wouldn't answer a call from an unknown number, especially late at night. But something compelled her to pick up. "Hello," she said, her voice cautious. There was silence on the other end. She frowned, checking to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Hello, who's this?" A faint static crackled through the line, followed by a soft, almost hesitant whisper. "Emma," her breath caught in her throat. The voice was faint, almost ethereal, but it sounded oddly familiar. "Who is this?" she asked, her heart beginning to race. The line went dead. Emma stared at her phone, her pulse quickening. She tried to rationalize it, a prank call, a wrong number, but the way the voice had whispered her name sent chills down her spine. "Hello?" This time, there was no static. Instead, she heard the same voice, clearer now. It was soft, trembling, and undeniably familiar. "Emma, it's me." Her grip tightened on the phone. "Who's this? Stop playing games." The voice broke slightly, as if choking back tears. "It's Mom." Emma froze. Her mother had passed away 3 years ago. The pain of losing her so suddenly had been a wound she struggled to heal. Now, hearing her mother's voice felt like a cruel trick. "This isn't funny," Emma said, her voice shaking. "Whoever this is, stop pretending." "Emma, please, don't hang up," the voice pleaded. "I need to warn you." Emma's stomach churned. The voice, it sounded just like her mother's. Every inflection, every pause, it was too perfect to be fake. But how could it be real? "Warn me about what?" she whispered, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting something to jump out at her. There was a long pause before the voice spoke again. "Don't open the door." Before Emma could respond, a loud knock echoed through her apartment. She nearly dropped the phone as she whipped her head toward the door. Her heart was pounding in her chest. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice cracking. No answer. She glanced at her phone, but the call had disconnected. The screen displayed only the time, 11:47 p.m. Her trembling fingers hovered over the number pad as she debated calling the police. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. Still no answer. Emma's mind raced. It was late. No one should be visiting her, especially not on Christmas Eve. Her friends rarely came over unannounced, and she hadn't ordered anything. Could it be a neighbor or something worse? She tiptoed toward the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. Emma backed away from the door, her mind spinning. The calls, the knock, none of it made sense. She double-checked the locks, then retreated to her couch, clutching a pillow to her chest. Her phone buzzed again. She flinched but answered it immediately. "Whoever this is, I'm calling the police," she shouted into the phone. "Emma, The voice interrupted, softer this time. "It's me. Please listen." Tears welled up in her eyes. "This isn't possible. My mom is gone." "I know, sweetheart," the voice replied, filled with sorrow. "But I'm here to protect you. You need to trust me. Don't open the door tonight, no matter what you hear." Emma was on the verge of breaking down. "Why? What's going on?" "There's something outside," the voice said, barely above a whisper. "Something that wants to come in. It feeds on loneliness, on fear. And tonight, it's looking for you." The line went dead again, leaving Emma in suffocating silence. She glanced around the room, every shadow suddenly seeming darker, every creak of the apartment louder. The knock came again, but this time, it was accompanied by a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, guttural growl. Emma's breath hitched as she pressed her back against the wall. She grabbed the fireplace poker, clutching it tightly in her trembling hands. The growling stopped, replaced by a soft, almost melodic voice. "Emma, it's me, Mom. Please, let me in." Her eyes widened in horror. It was the same voice from the phone, but something was off. The warmth and familiarity were gone, replaced by a hollow, mechanical tone. "I know you're scared," the voice continued, dripping with false affection. "But it's cold out here. Let me in." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she shook her head violently. "You're not my mom," she screamed. The thing outside slammed against the door, rattling it in its frame. Emma screamed, stumbling backward. The lights flickered, and the room grew colder. Emma's phone buzzed once more. She fumbled to answer it, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "Emma," the voice said urgently. "It's getting stronger. You have to stay calm." "What is it?" she sobbed. "What does it want?" "It wants to take your place," the voice replied, "to become you. If you let it in, it will wear your skin, live your life, and you'll be lost." Emma's chest tightened. "How do I stop it?" "You can't fight it," the voice said. "You can only endure. Keep the door locked, and don't speak to it again. It will try to trick you, to break you, but you're stronger than it is." Emma clung to the words like a lifeline. The banging on the door grew more violent, the voice outside shifting into a cacophony of cries, growls, and whispers. For hours, Emma sat on the floor, her back against the wall, gripping the fireplace poker. The thing outside didn't relent. It scratched, banged, and whispered through the door, its voice constantly shifting, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes eerily calm. "You can't keep me out forever," it hissed. "You're all alone. No one's coming for you. Let me in, and it will all be over." But Emma refused to respond. She covered her ears, reciting Christmas carols under her breath to drown out the noise. The hours dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, as the first rays of dawn crept through the window, the noise stopped. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight in the room lifted. Emma cautiously approached the door, peeking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Emma didn't sleep that morning. She packed her belongings and left the apartment as soon as it was safe to do so. She spent Christmas Day at a coffee shop, surrounded by strangers, grateful for the noise and company. In the days that followed, she couldn't shake the events of that night. The calls, the voice, the thing at her door, it all felt like a nightmare. But every time she doubted herself, she remembered the whispered warning. It feeds on loneliness, on fear. Emma moved out of the apartment soon after, choosing a place in a lively neighborhood filled with people. And though the holidays remained bittersweet, she was never alone on Christmas Eve again. Nestled high in the mountains, the Parker family cabin stood surrounded by a pristine blanket of snow. The tall pines loomed like sentinels against the clear winter sky, their branches heavy with fresh powder. It was Christmas Eve, and the Parkers, Laura, Jack, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, were thrilled to spend the holiday far from the bustling city. The air was crisp and filled with the earthy scent of pine and snow. Inside the cabin, a crackling fire warmed the cozy living room, and the faint hum of Christmas carols played from an old radio. Sophie darted around the cabin, unable to contain her excitement. "Can we make a snowman now, please?" she begged, tugging on her father's arm. Jack laughed. "All right, kiddo. Let's do it before the sun sets." Laura glanced out the window, her smile faltering for a moment. The forest seemed darker than usual, the shadows lengthening quickly as the daylight faded. But she shook off the unease. It was just her imagination. "Go ahead," she said, forcing a smile. "I'll get dinner ready while you two play." Bundled in thick coats and scarves, Jack and Sophie stepped outside. The snow crunched under their boots as they made their way to a small clearing in front of the cabin. Sophie immediately got to work, rolling the snow into a large ball for the base. "This one's huge," she exclaimed, struggling to push it into place. Jack laughed, helping her stack the snowballs. "There we go. Now he just needs a face." Sophie ran back to the cabin, returning with a carrot, some pebbles, and an old scarf. Together, they gave the snowman a smiling face and draped the scarf around its neck. Finally, Jack found 2 sticks to serve as arms. "What do you think?" he asked, stepping back to admire their handiwork. Sophie grinned. "He's perfect. I'm going to name him Mr. Frost." Jack chuckled, ruffling her hair. "All right, Mr. Frost it is. Let's head inside before we freeze." As they made their way back to the cabin, Sophie glanced over her shoulder. The snowman stood motionless, its grin fixed in place. But as the shadows deepened, she thought she saw something strange just for a moment. It looked like Mr. Frost had shifted slightly, as if leaning forward. That night, the family gathered by the fire to open one present each, a Parker family tradition. Sophie tore into her gift eagerly, revealing a new set of paints and brushes. "Thanks, Mom and Dad," she said, her face lighting up with joy. "You're welcome, sweetheart," Laura said, sipping her cocoa. "Just don't stay up too late painting. Santa won't come if you're awake." Sophie giggled, hugging her parents before heading upstairs to her room. As Jack locked up for the night, he glanced outside. The snow had stopped falling, and the forest was eerily silent. His eyes drifted to the snowman. It stood exactly where they had left it, its cheerful grin almost mocking in the moonlight. Jack hesitated, feeling a strange unease. Shaking his head, he muttered to himself, "You're overthinking things," and went to bed. The next morning, Sophie's excited shouts woke Laura and Jack. "Mom, Dad, come look," she yelled from the living room. The couple rushed downstairs to find Sophie staring out the window, her face a mixture of awe and confusion. "What is it, sweetie?" Laura asked, kneeling beside her. "Mr. Frost," Sophie said, pointing. "He moved." Jack frowned and followed her gaze. Sure enough, the snowman was no longer in the clearing. It now stood closer to the cabin, its crooked grin facing the living room window. "That's strange," Jack muttered. "Maybe the wind pushed it." "It's heavy," Sophie said, crossing her arms. "The wind couldn't move him." Laura exchanged a worried glance with Jack but tried to keep her tone light. "Maybe some animals knocked it around. Why don't we go fix him after breakfast?" After breakfast, the family went outside to reposition the snowman. Jack and Sophie worked to roll the snowman back into place, but as they did, Jack noticed something unsettling. The snow around the base of the snowman was undisturbed, no tracks, no signs of it having been moved. It was as if it had simply walked. "Everything okay?" Laura asked, sensing his unease. "Yeah," Jack said quickly, forcing a smile. "Let's get back inside. It's freezing out here." That evening, as darkness fell, the unease in the cabin grew. Sophie was playing with her new paints while Laura prepared dinner. Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching them. At one point, He glanced out the window. Mr. Frost was gone. "Laura," Jack called, his voice tight with alarm. "What is it?" she asked, hurrying over. "The snowman. It's not there." They both stared out at the empty clearing, the snow reflecting the pale moonlight. Sophie joined them, her face pale. "Where did he go?" she whispered. A loud scratch at the front door made them all jump. Jack grabbed a poker from the fireplace and motioned for Laura to take Sophie upstairs. "Stay here," he said firmly, opening the door just enough to peer outside. The porch was empty, but the snowman now stood at the foot of the stairs. Its grin seemed wider, and one of its stick arms was raised, as if it had been scratching at the door. Jack slammed the door shut and locked it. "We're leaving tomorrow," he said, his voice shaking. That night, the family huddled together in the living room, too afraid to sleep. The cabin was silent except for the occasional crackle of the fire. But around midnight, a soft thud came from the roof. "What was that?" Sophie whispered, clutching her mother's arm. Jack grabbed the poker again and cautiously stepped outside. Snow fell from the roof, but there were no signs of movement. However, when he looked toward the clearing, the snowman was gone again. As he turned to go back inside, he saw Mr. Frost, now standing at the edge of the forest, its head tilted as if watching him. The next morning, the Parkers packed their belongings, ready to leave the cabin. But as they loaded the car, they found the tires slashed. Jack cursed under his breath visible in the freezing air. "We'll have to hike to the village," he said. "It's not far. Let's stick together." The family set off, trudging through the deep snow. But as they neared the forest, Sophie stopped abruptly. "He's following us," she whispered, pointing. They turned to see Mr. Frost standing a few yards behind them. Its grin seemed to stretch unnaturally, and its stick arms were now claw-like, reaching out toward them. "Run!" Jack shouted, grabbing Sophie's hand. They sprinted through the woods, the sound of crunching snow and snapping branches following close behind. Laura tripped, but Jack pulled her up, his heart racing. The snowman was closer now, impossibly fast despite having no legs. They burst into the village, breathless and terrified. The snowman stopped at the edge of the woods, its figure barely visible through the trees. It tilted its head once more before vanishing into the shadows. The villagers listened to the Parkers' story with grim expressions. One of the elders finally spoke. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "That snowman is no ordinary creation. It's the spirit of an ancient winter deity, angered when people disrupt the peace of its domain." The elder explained that the snowman was a harbinger of death, appearing only to those who dared to stay too long in the forest during winter. It would haunt its victims, feeding on their fear until it could claim them. The Parkers left the village that day, vowing never to return. But Sophie would always remember Mr. Frost, its crooked grin etched into her memory. And every Christmas, as snow fell outside her window, she would wonder if it was still out there waiting.